Welcome to Home Learning. This is computer science and today we're going to be looking at RAM and ROM. This lesson is all about RAM and ROM and the difference between them. The first part of the lesson you'll get a bit of information about RAM and ROM and then you'll have two activities to complete with an exam question and a review of that exam question. Over to Mr. Cooper to explain RAM and ROM.
Welcome back to another instalment of Revision with Sir. Yay! Today's topic is RAM and ROM. So, what's the difference? Is that right? No, okay, fine. No more bad jokes about sheep. We're going to get the information straight to you. Right, so what is the difference then? RAM is what we call volatile, which means you can save data to it, and when you turn the power off, the data is removed. ROM, however, is what we call non-volatile, which means when you turn the power off, the data stays. So that's difference number one. Difference number two is what is saved in each of these two things. The ROM stores things like the boot up instructions. It also saves things like the BIOS, which is the basic input and output system. It tells the computer where things like the hard drive are, what the keyboard is, what the mouse is, and where the monitor is so it can display things that you're looking at. The RAM stores things that you are running or have open at that particular time, such as the operating system, any apps that you might be running, or any data that you want to save or that you're working on. Remember, because RAM is volatile, when you turn the power off to your computer, all this information is taken away, whereas the ROM saves all your information, which is quite handy given that you're going to want to turn your computer on and off lots of times. You don't want your computer forgetting how to do that. Another difference is the size between these two things. RAM is quite large and normally measured in gigabytes. ROM is quite small and could be measured in kilobytes, maybe megabytes. And that's all we've got time for. So hopefully that was useful. Thanks very much. See you later.
So now you've heard from Mr. Cooper, you've got a task to do named Task 1 and you need to drag and drop the appropriate properties into the appropriate memory types. 3, 2, 1, go. Okay, time's up, so over to Mr. Barnes to review the answers.
Okay, so you've been asked to do an activity that considers the RAM and its role with the other types of storage in the computer. You should consider it for volatility, and that's whether it loses the data that's in it when the power's off, and also the size. So, hopefully you've completed this activity and rearranged the different elements, but let's put these in order now. We're starting with volatility. The key thing to remember is secondary storage, such as optical, magnetic, or flash devices, retain their data because they're secondary storage. Okay. Anything that's primary storage, by and large, will lose the data when the power's off. So, CPU registers, CPU cache, and RAM all lose data when the power's off. So, let's move that one up to there, that one up to there, that one up to there, and for the hard disk, retains the data when the power's off. So when you turn the power off, anything that's on the hard disk remains. Okay. Now, with regards to the size, the way I remember the size is the closer that element is to the CPU, the smaller it is, but also the faster it is. So the CPU registers and the CPU cache are part of the CPU, therefore they're going to be the fastest. Okay, but the registers are even closer than the cache. So when we're talking about registers such as the MAR, the MDR and such, we are talking just a few bytes. They just store one instruction or a very small piece of data. The CPU cache, which is part of the CPU and is used to store frequently used instructions or instructions that are about to be needed, is a few megabytes. And you've got different levels of cache, but we don't really need to worry about that at GCSE. The RAM then isn't part of the CPU, so it's slightly further away. It's connected to the motherboard, and as is the CPU, so it's a bit further away, but it is, these days, we're talking gigabytes. So you might see on TV 8 gigabytes of RAM, or memory they often call it on telly. And then finally the hard disk. Now the way I think of the hard disk further away, because normally it's connected via a cable, so it's further away. And these days hard disks, we're looking at terabytes. So, in summary, the closer to the CPU it is, probably the smaller it is. Anything that's primary storage will lose the data when the power's off, and the hard disk, which is secondary storage, keeps the data when the power's off.
So for your next task, you need to categorize whether a statement matches RAM or matches ROM. So time's up on that task. We're going to go to Mr. Barnes, who will review the answers.
Okay, so for this activity, you were given a series of statements and you needed to decide whether they were about RAM or ROM. Hopefully you've dragged and dropped them into the relevant area now. So, the first one, can store data when the power is turned off. So in the previous activity we looked at how RAM was primary storage and most primary storage devices do not store the power. So, can store the data when the power's off goes to ROM. Holds part of the operating system currently used when the PC is on. Well, that's RAM. RAM holds three things and one of them is the parts of the operating system currently in use. Holds any program data whilst the program is running. Once again, that is RAM. That is the second piece of information or data or thing that the RAM holds when it's currently in use. Used in embedded systems as a small store of software. Well, ROM chips appear in most embedded systems like washing machines and such that are hard-coded and have very specific instructions to complete, so that would be ROM. Used to launch a PC's operating system from the BIOS. Once again, that's ROM. When you turn the computer on and you get the black text with the right writing to show it's booting up, that's called the BIOS. And that allows the operating system to launch. And that's stored on a little ROM chip that's on your motherboard. The next one then is classed as volatile memory, meaning it loses all the data when the power's off. Well, this one is RAM. When you turn the power off to a device, whatever's in the RAM is lost. Used as fast access storage as it's quicker to access by the CPU. So referring back to our previous activity, it is quicker to access the RAM than the hard disk. And finally, it is classed as non-volatile memory and stores its data once the power is off. That's ROM. The ROM chip on the motherboard that's used to start the computer with the BIOS, that isn't lost each time you turn it off. So every time you turn the computer on, it can go to that ROM chip and load the relevant parts of the BIOS to boot into the operating system.
For your final activity, you're going to look at some previous exam questions. Now there's 3 questions to complete and it's a 5 mark in total, so 5 minutes starting now. Time up. So Mr. Barnes is now going to walk through those answers. Make sure you assess your answers as we go.
Okay, so let's have a look at these questions about RAM and ROM then. So Bob's computer has 512 kilobytes of ROM and 8 gigabytes of RAM. Describe the purpose of ROM in Bob's computer. So the word purpose is really important here. What that effectively means is tell me what ROM is used for. Now the entire question is worth 4 marks, so that means it's going to be 2 marks for the purpose of ROM and 2 marks for the purpose of RAM. So, first of all, what do we use ROM for in Bob's computer? Well, it stores the boot program. Also known as the BIOS. And what does that do? This allows the computer to load the operating system. And there's my answer for 2 marks. So let's have a look at how that works with the mark scheme. If we have a look here, we've got stores the boot program for a mark. Yep. This allows the computer to load the operating system. Load the operating system, 2nd mark, 2 marks. Let's move on and have a look at the next part of the question. So again, it says describe the purpose of the RAM in Bob's computer. So the previous activity showed that the RAM stores 3 things. Well, we need to mention 2 of these in our answer. So the key thing to remember with RAM is it stores things that are currently running. So first thing we can say is it stores the data currently being used. Okay. One of the other things that it stores is it stores parts of the operating system. Currently being used. Let's have a look at the mark scheme. So here I've wrote stores the data currently being used, and we can see that for the 2nd mark point there. Stores parts of the operating system currently being used. Stores part of the operating system that are running. The 3rd thing that could be mentioned is it stores the programs or applications that are currently running. The key thing with RAM is it stores things that are currently running. Notice how the mark scheme has these underlined. So if you don't mention that, you're not going to get the marks. The final question then is state one difference between RAM and ROM. The first thing not to write is one's got an O and one's got an A. So the obvious example is ROM is non-volatile. That means that when you turn the power off, it doesn't lose the data that's in it. Now, if you wrote this on its own, it wouldn't get the mark because you need to do that comparison. So you would need to say RAM is volatile. The other thing you can't say is one is volatile and one isn't. You need to say which one's which. So let's have a look at the mark scheme for this final question. As you'll see here very clearly, it says top bullet point, ROM is non-volatile, and RAM is volatile. Other options could be RAM can be expanded and ROM is a fixed size. Also, the contents of RAM change frequently. ROM is very difficult to change. The obvious difference here for RAM and ROM, and should always be the go-to option, is ROM is non-volatile and RAM is volatile. And there we have it. 5 full marks.
Okay, so that's your lesson on RAM and ROM complete. See you next time.